The world we live in can seem pretty illogical. The things people say, the ways we behave, the complex choices we have to make. What's the quickest way to get home? Can I trust any of you lot? Where did you all come from? That process of making sense of all this stuff, of sorting between the truth and the nonsense, comes down to one of the most simple and yet powerful tools ever created by humans: logic.
Yes. Yes. There's definitely beauty in logic.
Who would like to be bits of a computer?
In the building next door to me at work, there's a door and there's a sign on it that says, "This door must be kept closed at all times." I just look at this in amazement. Really? Why did you build a door then?
Is this sentence true or false? Philosophy, maths, science and language. Logic is the engine for all of them. In fact, it drives the fundamental process of reasoning itself. I'm a professor of computer science. Computer scientists tend to think that logic is the bee's knees. So it follows that I think logic is brilliant. Logic has inspired our greatest boffins.
I'm Socrates.
It's given us transformational technologies.
Delta 11, report your ocean entry point.
And even made us question what it means to be human. I want to see if there's any limit to what logic can do for us. So join me. It would be terribly illogical not to. Logic is right at the heart of what I do. Around 15 years ago, kind of by accident, I created something that had a really big impact here, on the trading floors of the City of London. It was a computer program I called Zip, and it used logic to replicate this. A centuries-old tradition of human traders, supposedly vested with very special skills, crammed into rooms, shouting at each other. It's ever so simple. Just a few logical inferences, decisions, and a little bit of maths. It learns from its trading successes and failures. Its aim is to trade as profitably as possible in a fast-moving market where levels of supply and demand are shifting rapidly. It turned out that Zip, built squarely on logic, was impressively proficient at this trading lark. In fact, today, in many markets, billions or trillions of dollars worth of deals go through with no human intervention at all, which is kind of mind-boggling. Every day, computer programs, on their own, do deals that determine the cost of everything from our fuel and food to the worth of our pensions. It's pretty important stuff. And every day, scientists like me earn a living using logic to find solutions to all kinds of other real-world challenges. So why am I not as rich as Bill Gates? Well, I gave away the Zip software for free, and looking back, that was probably not my most logical move. So what is logic? What does being logical even mean? A pint of lager, please. Well, all you need to explain it are three logicians and a boozer. Logic is actually all about the rules of correct reasoning. Let me tell you a joke. Three logicians walk into a bar. The barman says,
"Gents, would you three like a beer?"
And the first logician says,
"I don't know."
The second logician says, "I don't know." And then the third logician says,
Yes, we would all like a beer.
OK, so it's not exactly a side-splitting, laugh-out-loud gag, more of a chortle for nerds. But what went on there? Well, forgive me, I'm going to analyse that joke to death. Remember, the barman's question was, would all three of you like a beer? The key here is the all three bit. If any one of those logicians doesn't want a beer, then he'd be able to answer no. That's because if one doesn't want a beer, they don't all want one. Logician 1 does want a beer, but he can't speak for the others, so he has to say, I don't know. Exactly the same goes for Logician 2. Then happily for Logicians 1 and 2, Logician 3 also wants a beer, and so he correctly uses logical inference to arrive at the right answer to the question.
Yes. Yes, we would all like a beer.
At last, Logician 3 ends the torment because he can speak for everyone. Cheers to that. The important thing to understand is that logic isn't knowledge. Logic doesn't create knowledge. What it does is it gives us cast-iron rules for how to organise and handle knowledge. Even so, the quality of the conclusions you get out depends on the quality of the ideas that you put in.
Time, please, gents.
It would be a funny old world if we followed the rules of logic all the time. These days, logic is studied and taught in academic institutions the world over. Its history stretches back 2,500 years to the age of the Greek philosopher Aristotle. He created the first formal rules of logic that would govern good reasoning, clear thought, and reliable argument. Aristotle's most famous logical tool is the syllogism.
A syllogism is a certain simple kind of argument consisting of 3 propositions, and the first 2 propositions are the premises, the things that we take for granted in the argument. So, for example, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man. Those are our 2 premises. And from them we draw the conclusion, Socrates is mortal.
Aristotle's example is good logical reasoning. First, we take one premise, or thing we know. All men are mortal.
Yes, indeed. I'm Socrates.
Then, pair it with a second one.
I am a man.
Then we figure out, or infer, that, alas, Socrates is mortal.
That makes me sad.
If your premises are reliable and you follow Aristotle's rules, you get answers that are reliable too.
But Aristotle's theory of the syllogism can deal with more complicated arguments that don't just have all in them, but some in them, and not.
Take all these into account, and you find there are lots of ways to make a syllogism.
So if you multiply that up, you find that there are 256 kinds of syllogism. And Aristotle identified 19 of these as being logically valid, so that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true as well. And all the others of those 256 forms, you can have true premises but a false conclusion. So arguing in that way is fallacious. Those kinds of syllogisms are fallacies.
It's the old logical fallacy. All cats have 4 legs. My dog has 4 legs.
Therefore, my dog is a cat.
He's suffering from politicians' logic.
This is just one of Aristotle's fallacies. It looks similar to good logic. The premises are both true, but the way they're organised means the reasoning is completely backwards, and the conclusion bonkers.
Something must be done. This is something, therefore we must do it.
But doing the wrong thing is worse than doing nothing.
Doing anything is worse than doing nothing.
Such was the power of Aristotle's logic that scholars used and taught it, but actually didn't do a great deal to change it for the next 2,000 years. But it wasn't just philosophers that were enamoured of logic. By the 19th century, the public had fallen for it too. For this, our thanks must chiefly go to a mathematician who spent most of his life working at Christ Church in Oxford, Charles Dodson. He's much better known by his pen name, Lewis Carroll.
The mathematics books were mainly under his real name, Charles Lutwidge Dodson, but he chose to use his pen name, Lewis Carroll, for the game of logic and symbolic logic, clearly to give it a wider audience.
Explain yourself, child.
Alice's adventures may seem balmy, but curiouser and curiouser. She was actually up to her eyeballs in logic.
In The Mad Tea Party, the March Hare says, "You must say what you mean." And Alice replies, "Well, I mean what I say. It's the same thing, you know." Hatter says, "You might as well say that I see what I eat is the same as I eat what I see."
Gotcha! What else don't talk?
Dodson was so keen to introduce people to the delights of logic that he drafted a book initially called Logic for Ladies.
He was very conscious that girls in particular were not heard. They were not given the chance to go to school. Very few had the opportunity of going to university. They certainly weren't able to get a degree.
Happily for us blokes, Dodson had a change of heart, and Logic for Ladies was renamed Symbolic Logic. Together with The Game of Logic, it did surprisingly well.
He felt that young people needed a tool to detect fallacious arguments that they might meet in books and magazines. He wanted them to have the ability to detect that.
While Dodson's intentions would have made Aristotle proud, some of his syllogisms stand out today for the wrong reasons. What are you meant to conclude? No marks for saying Victorian England was intrinsically anti-Semitic.
I think Dodson would have wholeheartedly approved of today's most popular logic game, Sudoku. There's something really captivating about the fact that logic tells you that the answer must be in there, but you need to apply logical reasoning to find it. It can be really engaging, but it can also be really frustrating and annoying too.
Charles Dodson had been the first person to popularise the idea of logical reasoning and critical thinking. But for all its growing popularity, logic itself was due for an upgrade.
In 1847, this groundbreaking book was published. It's called The Mathematical Analysis of Logic. Now, this isn't logic for philosophers or puzzle fans. The author of this book argues that the real purpose of logic is mathematics. And this book was written by George Boole.
Born into a poor family in Lincoln, Boole mastered mathematics at a fantastically young age. And by 20, he'd opened his own school. Boole's big idea was that logic was actually closer to mathematics than philosophy. All you needed to do was change the words in a logical argument to symbols, and then it could be solved just like an equation. He called it his calculus of reasoning.
First, he demonstrated that the letters that we use in algebra to represent numbers can actually be used to represent whole classes of things in the real world. So, for instance, we might have the class X of things that are fluffy and the class Y of things that bark. Second, he introduced a set of operators for combining these classes of things. The three most important ones are and, or, and not, and they're known as Boolean operators in his honour. So if we redraw our classes so that they overlap, the bit in the middle, that's things that are fluffy and bark, X and Y. If we look at the whole area of the two circles, well, that's things that are either fluffy or they bark, so that's X or Y. And finally, if we think about the area outside, well, they're neither fluffy nor barking, so that's not X and not Y, things that aren't fluffy and don't bark, like me.
Boole's new mathematical logic reduces any logical problem to symbols that can be combined in new ways. And there was one final and crucial innovation.
In Boole's new mathematical logic, everything's either in or out. Statements are either true or false. Everything's either a 1 or a 0.
For example, if I were to ask my dog Floss, "Are you fluffy?" and "Do you bark?" she would have to bark yes. Taking 1 to mean yes and 0 to mean no, with Boole we get this. It was an entirely new form of logical reasoning. Seemingly anything could be boiled down to symbols and just 2 numbers. And it's in my field that Boole's vision would prove transformative. Almost a century after his death, his logic would become the language of computing.
My logical hero has to be George Boole. Boolean logic is so simple, yet so fundamental to explaining our world. And even the world today, which is full of complex systems that he could never have imagined. And Boolean logic allows us to reason about them. I think the application area and the use of logics has changed dramatically in the last 20, 30 years with the advent of computer science and software systems. Because fundamentally these systems are about zeros and ones, entities that map onto truth and falsity. And what I think is just absolutely brilliant is that we go back to lots of the logical ideas invented and conceived over 100 years ago before anyone imagined the systems that they'd be applicable to.
Boole never knew it, but thanks to him, all computers today process their information as binary digits or bits. With binary, any number can be represented by combinations of 1s and 0s.
I'm going to do an experiment. Come on in. So the cool thing about binary numbers is that they're really easy for computers to manipulate, to add or subtract or multiply or divide or to compare to each other. In fact, any time you see a computer doing anything, whether it's adding 2 numbers together or computing stock market derivatives, inside it's using Boolean logic to do just that.
I want to demonstrate how Boole's logic can be used for computing. At their simplest, computers work by passing bits of information, 1s and 0s, through a circuit, like the one that we're building here. The most important parts are the junctions where the bits of information are combined and passed on. These are called Boolean logic gates, and the way you order them determines exactly what the circuit can do. From simple addition to calculations that we could never do in our own heads, they can all be worked out with something like this.
I'm going to use these guys and some very simple logic gates and, not, and or, and a circuit that we've got out there in the school hall. And what this circuit's going to do is to add together 2 numbers to come up with one answer. Who would like to be bits of a computer? Come on up and I'll give you out your shirts, okay? This one is a number 1, which is for Ishmael. Where's Ishmael? Well, hey,
they're not just pretending, they will be a computer.
Charlie T, thank you very much for being an AND gate.
Normally, of course, computers work on electric currents. Our computer will be powered by kids, who will pass on their 1s and 0s by either tagging the next kid in line for a 1 or not tagging them for 0. It's time for the kids to take their places in our circuit. And, for the record, I've never tried this before.
OK, some of you are being AND gates. Do you remember what an AND gate has to do?
The rule for ANDs is they only get a 1 to pass on if they're tagged on both shoulders.
So now some of you are being OR gates.
ORs pass on a 1 if they're tagged on one or both shoulders.
Some of you are being NOT gates.
NOTs are different. They get a 1 to pass on if they're not tagged.
Numbers, you are the most important thing because the whole circuit is about processing numbers.
We're going to put these 4 bits into the circuit, which arranged like this represent 2 and 3.
Off you go.
The bits of information have been inputted. They're relayed on by the first set of kids. If they're following their rules, only some should be carrying ones, while others won't. At each gate, the bits are combined and passed on. They're nearly there. At last, the output numbers are either tagged or not.
So, we've got a 1, a 0 and a 1. A 4 and a 1, and that makes 5. And the numbers we added at the start were a 3 and a 2. So a 3 and a 2 moving through this circuit with all of you just doing very simple things, being and or not, ended up at a 5 this end. So you have calculated the right number. Today, all our computers are built using Boole's logic gates. Here we have 13, but a modern computer chip like this one might have 250 million. They're all doing exactly what these guys were doing, but an awful lot faster.
We just did a simple sum here, but Boole heralded a new era for logic, in which reasoning about anything could be done in the language of maths.
There are lots of different logics, because there's lots of different kinds of systems or worlds that we want to reason about. I've been applying logic to reason about a wide variety of complex systems. I've looked at communications for air traffic control systems, molecular biology. I've also looked at advanced telephony.
But regardless of the application, all logics have one thing in common.
Amongst all these logics, the unifying property is they're about axioms and rules, so the answer is unambiguous. We can automate the procedure of computing the answer in logics, but we still need to pose the question.
Taking exactly those questions and automating the way we logically answer them requires what's known as an algorithm. It's the province of my very own breed of nerd, the computer programmer. And there's nowhere more important for today's generation of up-and-coming young programmers than this, the annual International Olympiad of Informatics, held this year in Brisbane, Australia.
We're trying to find the best and the smartest students when it comes to computational thinking, algorithms, and programming.
On each competition day, everyone is set 3 questions, which must be answered within 5 hours.
The easiest one, you just had a bunch of locked doors and you had a bunch of switches. Each of the switches was connected to one of the doors, but you didn't know which switch was connected to which door. And what they ask for is to determine for each switch which door it's connected to and which position is the correct one.
Johnny Ho is last year's champion, so there's a lot to live up to. But things aren't quite going his way.
By now I've actually solved all 3, but I didn't actually solve them during the contest because there's just a lot of pressure.
We test the ability of students to come up with clever algorithms to solve algorithmic problems. They not only have to come up with the algorithm, but they have to write a computer program that runs the algorithm.
Algorithms turn real-world problems into questions that logic can help us answer. If, for example, these guys wanted to spend their day off competition duties defining the group of all animals in a zoo that are marsupials, the first step of the algorithm could be to ask, of all the animals I see, which would I find in the wild in Australia? No. Nope. No. Yes. No. I don't know. Yes. 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 Definitely not. Yes. Certainly not all of the yeses and don't knows will be marsupials, so the list can then be refined by asking which of these animals have pouches. And here there are options too. They could look in a book. They could ask Chris, he's an expert. Or they could crowdsource the question and go for the most popular answer. Each logical algorithm incurs a different cost in effort, time, or accuracy, but whichever way, they'd each get to an answer eventually. And there are certain situations where a good logical algorithm can be the difference between life and death. This is the NATS Control Centre in Swanwick, southeast England. At any one time, around 100 air traffic controllers are responsible for 200,000 square miles of airspace over the UK.
Delta 11, report your ocean entry point.
Landing over 2 million flights a year, it's perhaps surprising that until very recently, these folk did their job using brain power alone. But that's all changing. New automated algorithms have started to take on some of that responsibility for guiding the planes in our skies.
The equipment now is talking to the aircraft, and so whereas before the human was reacting with the human, and obviously there were sometimes mistakes made, the computers can now double check that interaction and provide a warning to the controller if anything is amiss. Equally, in terms of capacity, because it's reduced the amount of workload for the controller, we've seen capacity about 40% increase on some sectors because the computers are doing some of the logical calculations and thinking on behalf of the human being.
I think logics are really crucial as a tool for reasoning about the systems we use in our modern world. We are surrounded by these complex systems like air traffic control, railway signalling, the electricity grid. I think it's really important that we raise the next generation of users of these systems so that they know it's not magic. They also know that they have the tools of logic to understand and reason about the systems that they depend on crucially every single day of their lives.
Back at the International Olympiad of Informatics, it's day 2 of the contest. The judges are looking for programs to do logic that aren't just right, they have to be fast.
So if you have an algorithm that is technically correct, but it would take 100 million years to run, then you would score no points. If you have an algorithm that solves the same problem and runs in, say, 5 seconds, then you can score much higher points.
I think the simpler an argument is, the more beautiful it is. So if it can be expressed in perhaps just 10 words, that argument would be pretty neat.
Competition has finished. Thank you very much for your patience.
It's an anxious wait for the final ranking. I think this competition is, in all its geeky glory, an amazing event. With the ability to implement their problem-solving talents in the language of computing, these kids are going to be the future of all things logical.
First place winner of IOI is Li Jie-chen from China.
In the end, it's a Chinese 1, 2, 3. It's lucky the Brisbane competitors didn't have this problem to solve. It's one that no logical algorithm can cope with. All I want to know is, what do you think? Is this sentence true or false? Is it true or false? You can have this if it's false. The point is, if the sentence is false, then it's true, but if it's true, then it must be false. It's a paradox. But if it's false, it's true. My sign is inspired by the first known logical paradox from around 600 BC by the Cretan Epimenides of Knossos.
Well, if you read the sentence that this sentence is false, as its true meaning, then yes, it is false.
Epimenides wrote, all Cretans are liars. But he was a Cretan, so was he lying? If so, then all Cretans aren't liars, in which case he would be telling the truth.
Statement, isn't it?
It's a paradox. A paradox. Well done. Please be aware this sentence... Paradoxes are fundamental contradictions that logicians have puzzled over for centuries. They've been described as truth standing on her head to get attention. And for good reason. In the late 19th century, round about the same time that George Boole was developing logic or deduction as a branch of mathematics, paradoxes exactly like this became a really deadly serious matter. In fact, they came to threaten the very foundation of mathematics itself. The Austrian capital, Vienna. renowned for its music, elegance, legendary cafes, and exquisite cakes. But at the turn of the 20th century, it was also the place to be if you were interested in logic.
Despite its grace and gentility, Vienna can lay justifiable claim, perhaps more than any other city, to being the birthplace of the modern. For it was here, in art, design, philosophy, science and psychology, that people most boldly challenged the tired conventions and assumptions of the 19th century.
But what was modern? Was it about replacing religion and tradition with logical empiricism and pure reason? Or was it about admitting to a new uncertainty, the limits of our perceptions and the moral vacuum of the Freudian subconscious?
Until this point, it could be argued that logic wasn't exactly a topic on everybody's mind. But here, it was at the forefront of this titanic clash.
From the city's coffee houses to the University of Vienna itself, the struggle for modernity played out.
In 1894, the university commissioned a great ceiling painting for their ceremonial hall. The theme was the victory of light over darkness, and it had separate panels celebrating the great achievements of the university's faculties of jurisprudence, of medicine, and of philosophy. Given the subject matter, it was perhaps unfortunate that the artist that they commissioned for these paintings was Gustav Klimt.
In 1900, he presented them with Philosophy, a depiction of naked men and women drifting trance-like in empty voids. It expressed anything but victory, certainty, or optimism.
Klimt's proto-modernist vision of philosophy was shocking to the people of Vienna and deeply unsettling to the professors at the university. He was attacking everything that they stood for, and Klimt's paintings were rejected outright.
Hidden away for 40 years, the original works were destroyed by the Nazis. These replicas were finally installed on the centenary of their rejection. Klimt's dark vision had seriously offended the growing academic aspiration that science and mathematics would provide us with complete knowledge founded on absolute, provable truth. This was something it was hoped logic could provide.
In mathematics, this problem of definitive truth, of certainty, had recently become all too real. No one had yet proven the most basic rules of mathematics.
Those rules might say that 1 + 2 = 3, but without proof that they will never lead to a contradiction, you can never say for sure that 1 + 2 might not also equal 20, or anything else for that matter.
In the grip of uncertainty, a logic fever took hold.
Boole's logic had already been adopted by the greatest logicians of the day, but there was a problem. His method was simply insufficient to describe all of maths. The race was on for a new and more complex logic.
Over 20 years earlier, a German mathematician called Gottlob Frege had studied exactly this problem. And Frege's work ensured that logic was up to this search for certainty, which was unfolding right here.
If I had it in my power,
It was in Jena, Germany, in the late 19th century, that Gottlob Frege opened a new chapter in the story of logic. For him, there should be nothing, whether numbers or ideas, that could not be described and analysed using his new logical quantifiers.
everybody loves somebody.
So, with his new mathematical logic, he could express ideas like everybody loves Frege, everybody loves somebody, there is somebody whom everybody loves, there is somebody whom no one loves. And, alas, there is somebody whom Frege does not love.
That somebody who Frege probably did not love was British philosopher Bertrand Russell, who independently was engaged in pretty much exactly the same project, using logic to firm up the foundations of mathematics. In 1902, Frege was just days from publishing the second volume of his magnum opus on logic when he received a letter from Russell. And it was the kind of letter that any logician dreads receiving.
Russell had spotted a big problem. Both men's logic relied on consistently describing sets of things. You can have the set of all even numbers, or, for that matter, the set of all mums, or the set of all dogs. Almost all sets aren't members of themselves. The set of dogs isn't itself a dog. So if you take the dog set and bundle it up together with all the other ones like it, you get the set containing all sets that are not members of themselves. But this is the set of all sets that don't contain themselves, and it doesn't contain itself. So this set should include itself. But then, if it does, then this is no longer the set of all sets that don't contain themselves, so it can't be part of itself. It's one of those logical paradoxes. Frege immediately wrote back to Russell. Dear colleague, your discovery of the contradiction has surprised me beyond words. And, I should almost like to say, left me thunderstruck, because it has rocked the ground on which I meant to build arithmetic. Your discovery is at any rate a very remarkable one, and it may perhaps lead to a great advance in logic, undesirable as it may seem at first sight. Russell now took on Frege's project with an even greater zeal, to develop an even more outrageously complex logic that would get round this problem with sets, and so be free of paradox. After 9 years of toil, the monumental Principia Mathematica was published. It took over 360 pages to logically prove that 1 + 1 = 2. It was never going to be a bestseller, but here it had a huge impact.
It was magnificent, a whopping great bucket load of logical concrete poured right into the foundations of mathematics. Definitely a triumph, not a trauma, for philosophy.
But the final word on logic would not come from Bertrand Russell.
It was here that project came to a dramatic conclusion, centred on a group of thinkers called the Vienna Circle.
They were firmly pro-logic. For them, Russell's Principia Mathematica was manna from heaven.
So Vienna Circle had people who inspired them. They were their idols. One was Albert Einstein. One was Bertrand Russell. And these were the most prominent scientists of their day. The interest shifted almost imperceptibly at first from the foundations of physics to the foundations of mathematics and to logic. It came almost against their will that this became the most prominent topic of the Vienna Circle.
Once every 2 weeks, they would meet here, in this actual room. It's now a working physics lab. But when they met here, they had one aim, and that was to purge philosophy of anything that was neither directly observable through scientific experiment or derivable through the laws of logic.
This logical analysis of the meaning was the essential first step, and therefore it was forbidden to talk about such concepts like God, for instance, or metaphysical statements about the thing in itself or whatever, because you could never find a sentence that could be verified in a scientific way.
In fact, the Vienna Circle loathed the idea of metaphysics so much that when they met here, Rudolf Carnap, a former student of Frege's, appointed someone to shout M during their discussions at the hint of any illegitimate sentence. M stands for metaphysics. M! It's the logician's way of saying bollocks. Now, the thing is, he was saying M so much, M, that they got sick of it. Instead, they had him shout non-M any time that someone actually said something that was legitimate. Nicht M!
Despite the purity of their logical methods, the problem of uncertainty that had plagued logic likewise stalked the Vienna Circle.
Something that may have also imprinted this young generation of Austrian scientists was a scandal that happened in 1913 when it was discovered that the head practically of the counter-espionage service was a spy. And you see the task of a counter-spy service is actually to make sure that there are no spies around. But what happens when the head of that organization is a spy himself? This is a fundamental uncertainty. Yes, the Secret Service can work very well, but can you be sure that the Secret Service is not infected? And something similar is happening in mathematics. You make sure that there exist no contradictions. You build up big walls against uncertainty or so. But maybe within these big walls there is a contradiction sitting.
Contradiction bothered one man more than most, Kurt Gödel.
Kurt Gödel was the most reclusive member of the Vienna Circle. He'd had the finest logical training that you could imagine.
It was in one of Vienna's famed coffee houses in August 1930 that 24-year-old Gödel first revealed a discovery that would end forever the logical quest that Frege, Russell and the like had set themselves.
Gödel was one of the few who definitely had read all of Russell's Principia. He knew that for any logical system to be the foundation of mathematics, it had to be both complete and consistent. Gödel told Carnap that by studying the Principia, he had come to the conclusion that in any logical system, you could either be consistent or complete, but you couldn't have both at the same time.
In Russell's masterpiece, Gödel had discovered a contradiction that became known as incompleteness.
This means that in mathematical logic, there are going to be some truths which, although true, can never be proven to be so.
This result of Kurt Gödel about the limitations of mathematics and logics was a terrible blow to the optimism of the Vienna Circle, and some of the members took a long time to come to grips with it.
The grand search for absolute, provable truth had hit the buffers. By the mid-1930s, the Vienna Circle was over. The rise of fascism and the looming threat of war meant its members fled, were expelled, or killed. Kurt Gödel left Vienna for Princeton, where his own search for certainty also came to a tragic end.
Gödel became convinced that someone might try to poison him. The only person he would trust to cook and indeed to taste his food was his wife. And when she fell ill and was hospitalized, he starved. He literally reasoned himself to death.
The fact that all systems of mathematical logic were limited, that we could never have complete certainty, signalled the end of an era for logic. But for one British logician, Alan Turing, Gödel's work was the inspiration he needed to launch, inadvertently, a new and entirely more practical logic revolution. Alan Turing was just 23 years old when he imagined something extraordinary. He called it a universal machine.
The universal machine is an entirely imaginary, hypothetical device, and yet it's one of the most influential machines ever in human history.
The device Turing imagined could tackle any mathematical problem using a logical algorithm encoded in its own limitless memory.
In 1936, Alan Turing published a paper in which he proved that you couldn't decide beforehand which mathematical problems the machine would be able to solve and which would just cause it to run on and on and on forever.
That there are some problems that are simply uncomputable was startling and yet another blow for mathematics. But it was also the beginning of something entirely unexpected and destined to cement logic's role in the modern world.
It's an extraordinary, almost exquisite paradox that in demonstrating that some things can't be proved using a logical machine, what Alan Turing did almost single-handedly launched a technology revolution.
Turing's universal machine is what we today call the computer. While stationed here at Bletchley Park during the Second World War, Turing began to implement his abstract ideas as real logical hardware.
Working with Gordon Welchman, Alan Turing developed this machine. It's called the bomb. It's a bit loud. It's a form of electromechanical computer, and its logical function was to decode the messages that the Germans were sending using their Enigma encryption machines.
But then Turing's colleague, Tommy Flowers, went a step further.
This is Colossus. It was built to crack another German encryption machine called the Lorenz. And for the men and women who built and operated it, it was an astonishing achievement. It shortened the war. But I think it's special for another reason. You see, this is the world's first programmable electronic computer. It uses digital information, binary, the streams of ones and zeros that are in all modern computers. And these vacuum tubes down here, they're wired together to be our Boolean logic gates, which perform Boolean operations and calculations.
Colossus might not look high-tech to us, but it's hard to express just how important it was.
The significance of all this as a piece of human engineering is on a par with the pyramids or the printing press or steam power, and yet it was all top secret. All these developments of electronic programmable computers here at Bletchley Park were classified, and the details were only declassified in the late 1970s.
After the war, Turing went on to help build some of the world's first stored program computers. At their core, it all comes back to logical reasoning.
Think about this. We're all surrounded by things that rely on some kind of logical machine or code. The failure of logic to deliver foundational answers for mathematics nonetheless gave rise to one of the most significant achievements in all of science and engineering.
It started with those huge, secret, single-purpose computers, and yet, right from the very beginning, some folk were already imagining the next big thing.
We're still finding out what logic will do, but everybody's got 'em. You got a logic in your house. It looks like a vision receiver used to, only it's got keys instead of dials, and you punch the keys for what you want to get. It's hooked into the tank, which has the car.
In 1946, science fiction writer Murray Leinster imagined an impressive specimen of interconnected technology. He named it a logic.
Relays in the tank take over, and whatever vision program snafu is telecasting comes on your logic screen. Or you punch Sally Hancock's phone, and you're hooked up with the logic in her house. Also, it does math for you and keeps books and acts as a consultant chemist, physicist, astronomer, and tea leaf reader, with an advice to lovelorn thrown in. It's very convenient.
Well, that's extraordinary. It's a great characterization of the web that wasn't yet born. The digital world we live in, the computers that surround us, at their base are running Boolean logic. I mean, they're running actually electrical currents. Ones and zeros are the product of those electrical currents. But on top of that, there are layers on layers on layers of complexity, operating systems, machine code, applications that we use every day, from word processors to spreadsheets to the browsers we use. And when you have your Skype conversation with your aunt in Australia, you don't think of that interaction in terms of those ones and zeros. But without them, without the underlying processing, none of this would work.
Not only did logic launch the digital revolution, but it's also the tool we use to sort, search, and retrieve the information we want online.
The World Wide Web we have today represents the largest information construct humanity has ever created. It's 20 years old, barely, and yet we have billions and billions of pages encapsulating knowledge and information from all of human culture and all of human history. The challenge is to organize this massive information, this complexity, and logic gives us some of the perfect tools to do that.
With the World Wide Web of information, logic means we're all more interconnected and informed. But back in the city, the march of logical machines has come at a cost. And I don't mean all the traders are spending too much time on Facebook.
In the year that I was born, there were 22 separate stock exchanges in the UK, and this is how business was done. Now, this place, the London Metal Exchange, is the last venue where traders still go face to face.
First, technology squeezed out the need for traders to meet in person. And now it's the traders themselves who may be heading for extinction. Not long after I wrote it, IBM did some tests of the ZIP trading algorithm. And not only did they confirm that it worked, they showed that it outperformed human traders. When it comes to pure logical reasoning, the computers tend to beat us, hands down. It's an old adage, but people in this business joke that soon the only things you'll find on a trading floor will be a big computer, a man, and a dog.
The big computer's there to do all the trading. The dog's there to make sure that no one touches the computer. And the man's job? On the trading floor of the future, the man's job is to feed the dog.
Mind you, despite my role in inventing these black boxes, I'm grateful that there's still a human around to pull the plug, sometimes. The thing is, computers still need their logical algorithms to be written for them. So they might take our jobs, but we still have the upper hand. Yet ever since their invention, the question as to whether this will always be the case has been a matter of fierce debate. When the digital revolution was in its infancy, the possibility of computers developing human-like intelligence was the hottest topic in town. Could a machine ever think, using the rules of logic alone? Or is there more to us than that?
In 1950, Alan Turing published another visionary essay. In it, he predicted that by the end of the century, a computer would be able to converse with a human, and the human wouldn't know the difference.
In trying to achieve this, people in my field have created some truly amazing computing machines.
This is my university's supercomputer. And although it's bigger and noisier than Colossus, for every one Lorenz cipher that machine could solve, this can solve over 2 million. It takes up the whole room.
Machines like this are the workhorses of today's data-centric research. All the switches, wires and logic gates have long since disappeared under the hood, meaning that for TV, we have a habit of trying to pretend that this doesn't all look like a load of, well, cupboards. Or a laundrette.
Turing thought that by the time we developed computers as powerful as this, we would also be capable of programming a machine with sufficient rules of logical reasoning that its intelligence would rival that of us humans. That was then, and remains now, a very controversial idea.
We like to think of our intelligence as raising us to a level above the rest of the creation. We associate it with the idea perhaps of an immaterial soul, being not just one amongst other animals, but special. And what Turing was suggesting was that this special quality could belong to a lump of computing machinery, and it could reason just as well as we could, maybe even better.
At Bletchley Park, Turing had sketched out algorithms for playing chess. At that time, the chessboard was dominated by some of the world's most brilliant, strategic, logical, mathematical brains. And so it became the battleground for an entirely new challenge for logic: artificial intelligence.
In 1997, the most famous public battle between man and machine took place. Garry Kasparov, the reigning chess world champion, had previously trounced IBM's chess-playing computer, Deep Blue. During their rematch, for the first time ever, he was beaten.
Kasparov has resigned. When I see something that is well beyond my understanding, I'm scared, and that was something well beyond my understanding.
It was front-page news the world over. People demanded answers. Was this purely logical intelligence equivalent or even superior to the human brain?
In the past, people have tended to compare humans to the latest technology. So maybe the brain is like a clock, or maybe it's like a steam engine. Now, maybe it's like an electronic computer. What Turing would want to say, and I think correctly, is that there's something different about the equation of the brain with a computer.
He put it that both a brain and a computer are information processing systems, governed by logical rules.
In theory, there should be logical rules out there that would capture the way we think.
This was a very big idea, with profound, even troubling implications. If we knew those rules, then one day, theoretically, we could code a logical rendering of ourselves into a computer. All we'd need to reproduce all of human thought is logic.
My view is that there remain uniquely human characteristics, arguably the best ones, like altruism or creativity or love, that computers aren't even close to having programmed within their repertoire of logical reasoning. No one has yet created a logical machine that's just like us, and arguably that could take a very, very long time, if indeed it's possible at all.
And yet, surely we should marvel at what we have achieved with logic.
Remember, we created the rules of logic to pin down the truth and certainty that would otherwise so easily evade us. We harness logic in machines, and in doing so, we place the power of pure reason at our fingertips. Mind you, I'm still no good at Sudoku.